One of the most important conflicts in human history was about to take place in the ancient world in the year 331 BC. Two universes were on the verge of colliding on the vast Mesopotamian plains close to the ancient city of Gaugamela. Alexander the Great, a youthful Macedonian monarch, and his 30,000 warriors are on one side. The King of Kings, Darius III, on the other, ruled over the biggest empire in history, leading an army of 200,000 troops, according to certain historians. However, this is more than just a fighting narrative. It tells the story of how an apparently impossible cavalry move, unshakable courage, and tactical genius changed the trajectory of Western civilization forever. It tells the tale of how a 25-year-old who was undervalued by an imperial giant turned his adversary's conceit into a deadly weapon. We must travel back a few years to really comprehend what transpired on those parched plains of modern-day Iraq. In 334 BC, Alexander started his war against the Persian Empire by crossing the Hellespont. His reputation as a strong leader was cemented by his early triumphs at Granicus and Issus. However, Darius was not impressed. The Persian king had not lost the war, but he had lost 2 battles. Nor, of course, had he lost confidence. Darius knew the figures. From the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf, and from India to Egypt, the Persian Empire was vast. It had an almost infinite supply of materials. The finest soldiers from dozens of vanquished peoples, the Scythian cavalry, the Indian war elephants, the scythed chariots of the steppe peoples, and the terrifying Persian immortals were all part of its army. How could a young Balkan monarch from a small hilly area manage to overcome all of this? Darius had good reason to be conceited. For 2 centuries, the known world was ruled by the Persian Empire. It had withstood the assault of the Scythians, Babylonians, Greeks, and Egyptians. In the 6th century BC, Cyrus the Great established the foundation for this empire. Its borders had been extended to the edge of the known world. Millions of warriors had been commanded by Xerxes against Greece. And now, with his little Macedonian army, this young man believed he could topple everything. Alexander, however, was no typical conqueror. He had been taught by one of the greatest thinkers in history, Aristotle. He had learned the art of diplomacy, leadership secrets, and military tactics since he was a little boy. Macedonia was a barbarous state before his father, Philip of Macedon, turned it into a military force that was revolutionary. The Macedonian phalanx had shown an almost unbeatable resistance to conventional combat. More importantly, though, Alexander had a drive for victory that Darius had not. The young Macedonian king was engaged in more than just territorial defense. He was engaged in a battle for world dominance. Every triumph strengthened his desire. Every city he overran made him more determined. His confidence grew with each enemy he vanquished. The Persian monarch had tried to negotiate after Alexander had routed a considerably larger Persian army at the Battle of Issus, even taking Darius's family prisoner. He offered Alexander a fortune in gold, half of his empire, and his daughter's hand in marriage. Alexander's response was simple. He didn't want half the Persian Empire. He wanted everything. Darius was enraged by this rejection. How could this haughty young man turn down such a generous offer? The King of Kings determined it was time to deliver a final lesson to the petty Macedonian invader. He called forth armies from all around his enormous realm. He called in the most dreaded armies, the most experienced fighters, and the best generals. He prepared himself for a conflict that would definitively end Alexander's aspirations. The location of this pivotal conflict was carefully chosen. The geography provided by the plains near Gaugamela offered the perfect canvas for Persian strategies. Large, open, and flat, they would maximize the effectiveness of Persian cavalry and scythed chariots.
There would be no rivers to direct the fighting, no hills to impede mobility, and no woodlands to conceal ambushes. Numbers would be the deciding factor in this open combat. Weeks before the war, Darius reached the battlefield. He commanded that rocks and other obstructions that might obstruct his chariots be removed in order to better level the terrain. He arranged his soldiers in a well-thought-out formation. He positioned his finest infantry, the Persian immortals, elite forces that had never lost in open combat, in the middle. He placed his most dreaded cavalry, the quick Scythian cavalry, renowned for their hit-and-run tactics, and the Persian catifacts, highly armored horsemen, on the wings. The front of Darius's battle line, however, was where the big surprise was. 200 war chariots with cutting blades on the axles and wheels. Decades of fighting have refined these war machines. They could tear apart any formation that dared stand in their path, forming genuine corridors of death when launched against an enemy line. The 15 war elephants that Darius had returned from India were even more menacing. To any army that had never encountered them, these enormous beasts, each bearing a tower full of archers on their backs, were a sight to behold. Though few had engaged in combat, the Macedonians and Greeks knew of tales of these war monsters. Even Alexander's most seasoned veterans were frightened when he arrived at the outskirts of Gaugamela and saw the strength of the Persian army. Darius's army was at least 5 times as big as Alexander's, according to modern estimates. Maybe it was time to embrace Darius's overtures of peace, some Macedonian warriors whispered. Others argued that it would be better to withdraw and engage in combat on more advantageous ground. But there was no reluctance on Alexander's part. As his warriors slept restlessly the night before the battle, he strolled around the camp, conversing with them, hearing their concerns and hearing their aspirations. He reminded them of past triumphs. They had previously beaten greater Persian armies, he reminded them. He reminded them that they were fighting for Western civilization and all of Greece, not just Macedonia. Alexander got up before the sun came up on October 1st, 331 BC, the morning of the fight. His generals found him plotting movements and examining maps. His most seasoned commander, Palminian, recommended a night attack. He argued, "We may surprise them in the dark."
If we could confuse their rankings, numbers wouldn't be as important. The idea was immediately dismissed. I'm not going to steal a win. Darkness is not necessary for Alexander to win. It was a classic display of his self-confidence and strategic acumen. He knew that his soldiers needed to see victory. They had to think they could fight an open, fair war against the biggest force in the world. Few people in history have had the opportunity to see the magnificence that the sun revealed as it rose over the plains of Mesopotamia. The Persian armies seemingly in limited rows, shining in the golden dawn light. Soldiers from dozens of different countries, including spearmen, foot archers, and armored knights, came together under the banner of the King of Kings. On the other hand, the Macedonian army was smaller but well organized, with sarissas forming a forest of spearheads that covered the entire front line. From anywhere on the battlefield, Darius could be seen riding an elaborate golden chariot as he assumed his position in the middle of his army. It was a purposeful demonstration of strength and confidence. The King of Kings refused to hide himself behind his army. He would personally lead them to demonstrate to everyone that he was unafraid of the young Macedonian monarch. Alexander, astride his renowned black horse Bucephalus, took up position on the right wing of his army. Wearing his brightest armor, he was easily identifiable from a distance thanks to the white plumes on his helmet. When they saw him, his soldiers' courage was rekindled. They wouldn't be terrified if Alexander wasn't. Alexander's formation exemplified tactical genius that was adaptable. He positioned the heaviest and most seasoned soldiers, his traditional phalanx, in the middle. He placed Parmenio with the Thesis cavalry, who was renowned for their endurance and discipline, on the left wing. Alexander would personally lead the Macedonian cavalry's finest, known as the Companions, on the right wing. His angled formation, however, was the real invention. Alexander had slanted his formation to allow his right wing to advance more quickly than the center, rather than forming a conventional straight line. It was a dangerous strategy that needed impeccable timing and organization. It might cause his soldiers to split off and his army to be destroyed if it is carried out poorly. If done correctly, it might provide him the chance to take advantage of the Persian army's one weakness, its size. However, Darius used his first psychological weapon before any tactical moves could be made. The 200 war chariots started to move across the plain, their blades shining in the sunlight, and the sound of wheels and hooves reverberated throughout the battlefield. It was a horrifying scene designed to demoralize the adversary before the actual conflict even started. The sight of the approaching chariots made the Macedonian warriors on the front lines' hearts beat. This was a weapon of war that many had never encountered before. Even the most courageous warriors would have been frightened by the tales of what these swords could do to an infantry line. Instinctively, several soldiers started to flee, but Alexander had his men ready for this. He had been practicing certain strategies against war chariots for weeks. His soldiers were fully aware of what to do. The Macedonian phalanx made a move that caught the Persians off guard as the chariots got close to a crucial distance. The phalanx broke off into smaller groups, allowing passageways between the formations. These tunnels were used to funnel the chariots, which were impossible to control exactly after they were launched at full speed. As the chariot drivers and horses passed, the Macedonian warriors, shielded by the flanks of their formations, attacked them with their long cuirasses. The Persians suffered greatly as a result. Most of the chariots moved through the Macedonian lines without incident, emerging in the rear guard where the reserve men could easily take them. Before they could do much harm, the cuirasses annihilated those who tried to directly attack the Macedonian formations. In addition to failing, Alexander had gained a moral triumph by using Darius's psychological weapon. Darius became further incredulous as he witnessed his chariots being destroyed. How could the Macedonians have eliminated a weapon that had won the Persians dozens of battles before with such ease? But there was no time to think about failing. The actual conflict was only getting started. The Persian monarch gave the order for his soldiers to move forward. The cavalry on the wings started to advance, trying to cover the flanks of the Macedonian force. Slowly, the army in the center moved forward, their endless rows forming a wall of spears and shields that extended over the horizon. It was a powerful demonstration of coordinated military might. Alexander kept a sharp eye on the Persian advance. He was looking for the opportunity he knew would present itself. He had spent years researching Persian strategies. He knew their advantages and disadvantages. The size of the Persian army was its greatest asset and its biggest drawback. Alexander had deliberately designed to take advantage of the fact that such a large army was challenging to manage, communicate with, and coordinate once the actual fight started. His tilted arrangement was more than just a new approach. The trap had been set carefully.
Alexander's generals had practiced this tactic hundreds of times, yet no one on the Persian battlefield was ready for it when the Persian cavalry tried to encircle his right wing. Alexander gave the order for his entire right wing to move diagonally forward, not toward the Persian army's center, but rather toward the intersection of the Persian cavalry and the infantry's center, rather than retreating or making an effort to preserve his position. It was a very dangerous move that would reveal his own center. However, Alexander had estimated that his comrades' swiftness and strength would be sufficient to breach the Persian defenses before his own center could be overrun. One of the most amazing military operations in ancient history was the Companions' Charge. Riding the best Macedonian horses under Alexander's direct command, armed with long spears and keen swords, and shielded by armor made of polished bronze, they charged the Persian line like a monstrous spear. It had a terrible effect. The Macedonian attack's quickness and audacity took the Persian cavalry off surprise, and they were unable to mount a suitable defense. Like a hot knife through butter, the comrades sliced through their lines. The companions' spears tore the Persian warriors to pieces. The Macedonian horses' hooves stomped them, and Persian men were flung from their horses. But the psychological impact of the maneuver was more significant than the actual harm done. The Persian army had been taught to think it was unbeatable. In frontal warfare, no opponent had been able to breach a Persian battle line for decades. The Persian formation was rocked when they saw the Macedonians not only repel their onslaught, but also launch a crushing counterattack. Alexander proved why he was regarded as one of the greatest military geniuses in history at this very moment.
Rather than go on to take advantage of the opening he had made, he made a move that nobody, not even his own generals, had quite expected. In order to strike the Persian army's center from the flank, Alexander gave his friends the command to make a sudden 90-degree turn. The technique called for exceptional horsemanship, flawless timing, and faultless coordination. A single misstep or pause could cause the entire formation to collapse into chaos. However, the companions performed the maneuver flawlessly. A frontal attack against the Persian cavalry quickly evolved into a deadly flank attack against the Persian battle line's center. The Persian warriors were suddenly attacked from the flank, despite their training to deal with frontal attacks. Totally confused and incapable of moving their formations in a timely manner to react efficiently, the Persian line's center began to fall apart. Disciplined soldiers who had kept their places during the initial advance began to break and flee. Panic swept through the Persian ranks like wildfire. Without orders, entire units began to withdraw, leaving gaps in the line that the Macedonians quickly took advantage of. From his command post in the middle of the conflict, Darius watched as his well-planned army fell apart in front of his very eyes. The haughtiness he had experienced the morning of the conflict gave way to mounting fear. How had this happened? How is a force 5 times smaller defeating his enormous army? But Alexander's brilliance extended beyond the companions' move. He had planned his attack to precisely match the movements of other elements of his army. His core phalanx launched a concerted frontal charge at the same time his allies launched a flanking attack on the Persian center. The 6-meter sarissas on the Macedonian phalanx were incredibly effective against the haphazard Persian infantry. A wall of spearheads was moving relentlessly toward the Persian warriors, who were still getting over the shock of the cavalry attack. Against the Macedonians' long weapons, their smaller shields and shorter spears provided little defense. Palomino and the Thessalonian cavalry, meantime, were dealing with their own challenges on the left wing. This wing had been partially encircled by Persian cavalry, a precarious situation that would have caused the Macedonian left flank to collapse. But Palomino, who had fought in numerous conflicts, maintained order and discipline among his soldiers and led them in a mobile defense that stopped the Persians from taking advantage of their numerical superiority.
When Alexander broke the Persian center and dispersed most of the enemy army, he turned his focus to Darius himself, marking the pivotal moment in the war. The young Macedonian monarch had determined it was time for the two commanders to face off after spotting the golden chariot of the King of Kings. Alexander carried out the riskiest move of the fight, leading his friends in a direct charge toward Darius's position. He flung himself across the chaotic battlefield in an attempt to capture or kill the Persian leader, disregarding all tactical considerations and the risks of personally exposing himself in combat. It was a stunning and terrible charge. Alexander raced through the Persian lines like a natural force while mounted on Bucephalus, his white plumes flapping in the breeze and his armor shining in the sun. The friends pursuing him killed Persian troops who attempted to block his advance. He was targeted by archers with arrows, but he was shielded by his armor and riding prowess. Darius had to deal with the most trying time of his life when he saw Alexander coming straight at him. He had been the world's most powerful man for years. King and emperor bowed before him. At his direction, armies marched. When his name was mentioned, entire nations shuddered. A young man from a barbarous area of the Balkans was now riding straight for him, seemingly prepared to engage him in direct fight. The King of Kings was faced with a decision.
He had two options. He could fight to the death, endangering not just his own life, but also the future of his entire empire, or he could flee and save himself for a future battle. However, Darius's choice at this precise moment altered the path of history. By acknowledging defeat and maybe losing the respect of his soldiers and citizens for all time, the King of Kings made the decision that would determine not only the outcome of the conflict, but also the demise of his dynasty and kingdom. As he watched Alexander approach and his army crumble around him, turning his chariot, Darius left the battlefield. Darius's escape had an immediate and disastrous impact on Persian morale. When they saw their monarch running, soldiers who had battled valiantly despite their lines being shattered lost all will to fight on. Why should they continue to fight if even the King of Kings didn't think they could win? Like an infection, the flight swept through the Persian army. In an attempt to escape the devastation that was upon them, entire troops left their positions and started to retreat eastward. Even the Persian cavalry, which had so far remained somewhat organized, started to scatter. Alexander was in the position that few leaders in history had ever been in, when he saw Darius flee and the Persian army fall apart. He had completely routed an army that was far superior. He had shattered the foundation of the greatest empire in the world. He had demonstrated that his superior troops and tactical acumen outweighed any numerical advantage. However, Alexander once again showed his tactical acumen by preventing victory from becoming a haphazard quest. He maintained the discipline of his formations and directed a concerted chase that maximized the destruction of the enemy army while minimizing his own losses. Rather than letting his warriors disperse to raid the deserted Persian camp, the chase continued until dusk. There were thousands of Persian warriors killed or taken prisoner. Alexander gained control of Darius's royal wealth, which included his family, who had once again been abandoned. Above all, the invincibility of the Persian Empire was irrevocably ruined. The destruction caused by the Persian defeat was mirrored in the Battle of Gaugamela losses. Between 40 and 50,000 men are thought to have been slain, injured, or captured by Darius's army. Less than 500 troops were lost by Alexander's army. Although statistics don't often tell the whole story, this casualty ratio was unusual in ancient military history. There was more to Alexander's actual triumph at Gaugamela than just military might. It was both political and psychological. He had demonstrated the invincibility of the Persian Empire.
He had shown that much could be defeated by a competent commander and well-trained soldiers. Larger forces through flawless execution and better strategies. Throughout the ancient world, word of the victory at Gaugamela circulated quickly. Cities that had lived under the Persian Empire for many generations started to think about changing their allegiance. Persian satraps started holding covert talks with Alexander's delegates. The idea of opposing the youthful Macedonian conqueror started to look pointless. For Alexander, Gaugamela was the last confirmation of his ideas and strategies. He had demonstrated that he wasn't merely a fortunate young man who had won a few fights by accident. He was a true military genius who could create and execute strategies that would transform warfare for future generations. For more than 2,000 years, military academies would use the cavalry move he had performed at Gaugamela as a model.
Precise timing, flawless coordination between various unit types, and the guts to lead from the front would become the benchmark by which subsequent commanders would be evaluated. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Alexander's triumph, however, was his capacity to modify his strategy in response to the unique situation he encountered. He hadn't merely used a military formula that already existed. He had analyzed his enemy's strengths and weaknesses, considered the terrain and conditions, assessed the capabilities of his own troops, and created a battle plan specifically designed to exploit all these variables. The angled formation he had used, the coordination between cavalry and infantry, the flanking maneuver executed by the companions, the disciplined defense led by Paulino on the left wing. Each of these components had been meticulously prepared and implemented with perfection. It served as an illustration of how even the most formidable obstacles might be overcome with careful planning, motivating leadership, and faultless execution. Alexander once again proved in the days after the fight that he was a brilliant political leader in addition to a superb military leader. He respected the native residents rather than pillaging the Persian region he had captured. He modified Persian institutions to suit his needs rather than dismantling them. He integrated the Persian lords he had taken into his own political structure rather than degrading them. His military victories resulted in long-lasting political domination thanks to this astute political strategy. Alexander's triumphs extended beyond his successful raids. They marked the beginning of the development of a new type of empire that would incorporate the best aspects of Persian and Greek culture. Meanwhile, in an effort to amass enough troops for a new resistance effort, Darius had fled eastward to the more isolated regions of his realm. But the loss at Gaugamela had mortally undermined his authority. His leadership began to be questioned by some of his satraps. Some started thinking about settling with Alexander. One of the greatest manhunts in history would be Alexander's search for Darius. The young conqueror pursued the escaping Persian king over the mountains and deserts of present-day Iran and Afghanistan for months. It was a testament to Alexander's unwavering willpower. He wouldn't be satisfied with just outwitting Darius. He desired to personally apprehend him in order to put an end to any potential Persian comeback. Darius's assassination by his own nobles, who believed that giving Alexander his body would get them clemency, marked the tragic conclusion of the hunt. When Alexander found Darius's body, he showed his respect for his vanquished foe. He recognized that the former King of Kings had been a worthy opponent who had just lost due to uncontrollable circumstances, and he ordered his burial with royal honors. With Darius's passing, the Persian Empire essentially vanished as a separate political entity. At the age of 26, Alexander had risen to become the leader of the largest empire in history. His hegemony extended from Egypt to the Central Asian steppes, from Greece to India. But Alexander's ambitions soon took them beyond the Persian Empire.
His triumph at Gaugamela had inspired him to aim for even bigger victories, continually searching for new worlds to conquer and pushing the boundaries of human potential. He would march eastward across Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the Indus Valley. A new chapter in world history began with the Battle of Gaugamela, which also signaled the fall of the Persian Empire. The Hellenistic civilization, which Alexander created by combining Greek and Eastern civilizations, would have a long-lasting impact on the advancement of philosophy, art, science, and politics. Alexander established the Egyptian metropolis of Alexandria, which would grow to become the ancient world's intellectual hub, the birthplace of scientific discoveries that would not be surpassed for more than a millennium, as well as the largest library in antiquity. Alexander created trade channels that would link the East and West in ways that would have an impact down to the present day. The site of one of the most important conflicts in history, Gaugamela, would come to represent the potential of overcoming seemingly insurmountable challenges by combining cunning, bravery, and resolution. The fight would be studied by generations of political and military leaders who wanted to know how Alexander had transformed a dire circumstance into a decisive victory. Long after the ancient era was over, the tactical principles shown at Gaugamela would still be applicable: the importance of coordination among various military units, the necessity of tailoring strategies to particular situations, the importance of individual leadership at times of crisis, the ability to maximize one's own strengths while taking advantage of one's adversary's deficiencies. These ideas would all become cornerstones of military instruction in the West. More than 2,000 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte would thoroughly examine Alexander's campaigns, especially the Battle of Gaugamela. Alexander's cavalry move would be seen by the French emperor as the perfect illustration of how boldness and speed might make up for numerical inferiority. Alexander's strategies on the Mesopotamian plains would be echoed by Napoleon's own strategies in the Battle of Austerlitz. However, Gaugamela's impact went well beyond the military domain. The conflict showed that smaller, more focused, and better organized forces may overthrow supposedly unbeatable civilizations. Throughout history, resistance and revolutionary movements would draw inspiration from this idea, ranging from uprisings against the Roman Empire to the American independence wars. Leaders would point to Alexander's example as evidence that courage and cunning could overthrow tyranny. Alexander's experience of psychological metamorphosis at Gaugamela is likewise deserving of special attention. He had been a young, ambitious monarch attempting to establish his worth before the fight. Following the conflict, he rose to fame as Alexander the Great, a renowned victor whose mere presence on the battlefield was sufficient to frighten enemies and inspire supporters. Military triumph was not the only factor in this change. It resulted from Alexander's actions during the conflict, his readiness to lead the riskiest charge himself. He insisted on engaging in open conflict with the largest army in the world and refused to accept tactical concessions. All of these decisions solidified his reputation as a fearless commander who refuses to concede defeat. An era would come to an end with the passing of Alexander's renowned warhorse, Bucephalus, a few years after Gaugamela. The horse that had escorted Alexander into the Persian lines on that fateful day had become a legend in its own right. Alexander acknowledged that the animal had served as more than just a mode of transportation, and at its death established a city in its honor. It had participated in the greatest conquests in history. For Alexander personally, Gaugamela had complicated and, in many respects, tragic repercussions. Expectations were impossible to meet because of his exceptional achievement. Every victory thereafter would need to be even more stunning, every achievement even more remarkable.
His choices and actions would start to be influenced by the psychological strain of living up to his own legend. Alexander's demeanor started to shift as he carried on with his eastward conquests. After Gaugamela, the young Aristotelian-educated man showed extraordinary political acumen by embracing Persian traditions, which caused a rift with many of his Macedonian supporters. He started requiring his subjects to bow down in front of him, which the Greeks viewed as barbarous. One of the most fascinating aspects of human history is demonstrated by these changes in Alexander's personality, how even the most extraordinary people may be changed by enormous power. The young guy who had honored the deceased Darius, out of humility, started to think of himself as divine. The commander who had been kind with captive soldiers started putting subordinates who disagreed with his choices to death. However, the significance of what Alexander accomplished at Gaugamela cannot be downplayed, especially in light of these subsequent developments. He had shown that individual brilliance, careful planning, and faultless execution could overcome any challenge on that October day in 331 BC. He had demonstrated that creativity and courage could overcome the constraints placed by custom and tradition. After Gaugamela, Alexander expanded his kingdom at a rate that is almost unthinkable by today's standards. He overran lands on 3 continents in less than 10 years. He created almost 20 cities that bore his name. He developed an administrative framework that was efficient in dozens of cultural contexts. He fostered cultural fusion on a never-before-seen scale. The precedent established at Gaugamela played a significant role in enabling this exceptional speed. Alexander was not just another ambitious conqueror, as the war had demonstrated. He was a historical phenomenon that went beyond the usual boundaries of human experience, a force of nature. Before the fights had started, this reputation created allies, dismantled opposition, and opened doors. Instead of facing the tragedy that had befallen the Persian army at Gaugamela, many cities and territories who might have resisted other conquerors willingly submitted to Alexander in order to negotiate advantageous terms. This was one of the most important outcomes of the conflict. It created an inevitable pattern that greatly facilitated subsequent victories. Only 8 years after Gaugamela, Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. His untimely demise prevented the ancient world from undergoing an even more profound metamorphosis. Ambitions to explore the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, venture westward into Spain and North Africa, and conquer Arabia, these projects all perished with him. Despite his premature passing, Alexander left a lasting and irrevocable impression on the world. The Persian Empire never bounced back. For generations to come, the Hellenistic culture he promoted would shape the course of civilization. For generations to come, the cities he created would serve as hubs for study and trade that connected the East and West. The so-called Diadochi, Alexander's generals, divided his empire after his death, resulting in a string of Hellenistic kingdoms that ruled the ancient world until the emergence of Rome. Ptolemy would become the ruler of Egypt and create a 3-century-long dynasty. The majority of the old Persian Empire would be ruled by Seleucus. Asia Minor would be dominated by Antigonus. These kingdoms would each carry the legacy of Gaugamela. Alexander's conquests would have a significant impact on Rome, which would go on to subjugate all of these Hellenistic kingdoms. Greek and Eastern elements, initially combined in Alexander's forces, would be assimilated into Roman civilization. The young Macedonian monarch was the first to understand the very concept of a worldwide empire that would later become vital to Roman identity. For millennia, commanders would be influenced and continue to evolve Alexander's military strategies. He developed heavy cavalry, which would eventually dominate medieval battlegrounds.
His demonstration of synchronization among various troop types would go on to become a cornerstone of contemporary military art. Military academies all throughout the world would continue to stress the value of the personal leadership he embodied. Gaugamela is still studied by military leaders in the 21st century as an illustration of how superior execution and tactical inventiveness may triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The conflict is examined in military strategy classes, talked about in seminars on business leadership, and referenced in research on handling crises and making decisions under duress. There are lessons to be learned from Alexander's leadership psychology at Gaugamela that go beyond the military setting. His capacity to give his followers courage in the face of insurmountable challenges, his readiness to entrust people with the risks he requested, his capacity to skillfully adjust to shifting conditions while staying focused on strategic goals. All of these facets of his leadership are still applicable in contemporary settings. Important lessons can also be learned from Alexander's handling of both triumph and pre-battle pressure. He didn't let fear stop him from making decisions. His capacity to channel his soldiers' nervousness into concentrated energy, his capacity to remain organized and disciplined during intense fighting. These attributes demonstrate how outstanding leaders can use their own performance as an example to improve the performance of entire companies. The strategic legacy of Gaugamela goes beyond short-term tactical considerations. The conflict illustrated the value of long-term planning, obtaining precise enemy intelligence, and adapting scarce resources to maximize comparative advantages. Alexander had spent years studying the Persians' advantages and disadvantages. He had also developed weapons and strategies that were tailored to the circumstances they would experience. The conventional perception of Alexander as an impetuous young man who depended mostly on charm and good fortune stands in stark contrast to this deliberate and planned approach. In actuality, his greatest successes were the result of methodical preparation, thorough planning, and in-depth analysis. Gaugamela was the result of years of strategic and tactical planning. Another important factor in Alexander's success was his capacity to draw lessons from the past. His planning for Gaugamela took into account the lessons learned during the battles of Granicus and Issus. He had determined what was effective, what was ineffective, and what was in need of improvement. Throughout history, great military organizations have been characterized by a culture of continuous learning and adaptability. Alexander's conquests, which were made possible by the victory at Gaugamela, had an economic impact that was just as important as their cultural and political effects. For the first time in history, a truly global economy was established with the opening of trade routes between the East and the West. Silver from Spain, gold from Africa, silk from China, and spices from India. All of these commodities started moving through the networks of trade that Alexander had established. The effects of this economic unification were significant and long-lasting. Along these trade routes, cities at key locations grew and prospered. New industrial methods quickly transcended cultural boundaries. Innovations in technology developed in one region were quickly adapted and improved in others. The result was a period of great prosperity and technological progress that would not be matched for many decades. Alexander's introduction of monetary uniformity also had long-term economic effects. Trade was facilitated and transaction costs were reduced as a single currency moved from Greece to India for the first time. The Romans would later adopt and develop this innovation, and the idea of a single global currency remains important in today's global economy. The notion that one battle can change the destiny of entire civilizations, however, is perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Gaugamela's legacy.
The history of the West would have been entirely different if Alexander had lost that day. It's possible that Greek culture would never have left the Balkans. There could never have been the fusion of Eastern and Western ideas that defined the Hellenistic era. Rome might have had to contend with the Persian Empire that was still in power, which would have fundamentally changed the course of European culture. This historical sensitivity to specific incidents demonstrates how epiphanies can have far-reaching effects that last for centuries. The evolution of human civilization was irrevocably changed by Alexander's choice to use that specific cavalry maneuver at a specific point in a specific conflict. It serves as a potent reminder that when people act appropriately and at the appropriate moment, their deeds can transcend their current situation and become historical forces. Later generations' admiration for Alexander is another example of how great heroes can serve as role models who motivate others to do great things. Leaders throughout history have drawn inspiration from the examples set upon the Mesopotamian plains, from Julius Caesar, who is said to have sobbed while reading about Alexander's accomplishments, to Napoleon, who brought a biography of Alexander on his campaigns. In a time when many individuals feel constrained by their circumstances, overpowered by seemingly insurmountable barriers, or disheartened by the scope of their problems, Gaugamela's inspirational role still has relevance today. A compelling lesson about human potential can be found in the tale of a 25-year-old who surmounted insurmountable odds with strategic planning, methodical execution, and unshakable courage. Ultimately, Gaugamela is more than a military conflict, a turning point in Alexander's career, or an ancient historical event. It is a classic illustration of how strategic vision, painstaking planning, motivating leadership, and faultless execution can overcome any challenge, vanquish any adversary, and accomplish any objective. More than 2,000 years ago, on an October afternoon on the plains of Gaugamela, the Persian giant who had sneered at Alexander's foolishness never smiled again. When brilliance and arrogance collided, the world was forever altered. The pivotal cavalry maneuver was more than just a military strategy. It was an instance of human transcendence that has reverberated over the ages, serving as a reminder that no desire is unattainable given the right planning, enough courage, and flawless execution. Therefore, as we reflect on this remarkable display of human potential, we are reminded that despite the greatest achievements in history and the most brilliant epiphanies, a higher power still controls the fate of both nations and individuals. Alexander's bravery and knowledge might have altered the path of history.
However, in His providence, the Lord God permits events to transpire in accordance with His ultimate will, surpassing all kings, empires, and conflicts. No matter how amazing, human brilliance is always subject to divine sovereignty, and we owe Him our utmost respect, understanding that every triumph, every accomplishment, and every moment of victory are only possible by the grace and consent of the Creator of all.